At the Zen Mountain Retreat in Big Sur, 48-year-old peaceful arts guru Master David Chen was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, when he criticized Chuck Norris as too aggressive and unable to understand martial arts' true spirit. He would learn that real balance requires both peace and power. The Zen Mountain Retreat, nestled high in the coastal mountains of Big Sur, represented everything that embodied the spiritual evolution of martial arts in America, a sanctuary where ancient Eastern wisdom had been carefully preserved and adapted for Western seekers who understood that true martial arts training was fundamentally about inner transformation rather than external combat. The retreat's wooden buildings, constructed in harmony with the natural landscape, seemed to emerge organically from the redwood groves and mountain meadows that surrounded them, creating an atmosphere of perfect peace where the only sounds were wind through trees and the distant rhythm of Pacific waves far below. The facility's design reflected a philosophy that viewed martial arts as a path to enlightenment rather than a method of fighting. Training halls featured polished bamboo floors, walls adorned with calligraphy that spoke of harmony and compassion, and windows positioned to frame views of the pristine wilderness that surrounded the retreat. Everything had been carefully designed to remind students that their practice was about cultivating inner peace, developing spiritual awareness, and learning to move through the world with grace and nonviolence. Master David Chen moved through this tranquil environment like a living embodiment of the principles the retreat was designed to foster. At 48 years old, standing 5 feet 10 inches with the lean, flexible build of someone who had spent decades practicing martial arts as a form of moving meditation, he radiated the kind of centered calm that could only come from years of dedicated spiritual practice combined with deep philosophical study. David's nickname Harmony hadn't been chosen arbitrarily. It perfectly captured both his teaching philosophy and his fundamental approach to existence. He believed that martial arts, when practiced correctly, were a path to perfect inner balance, a way of developing such complete personal harmony that external conflict became not just unnecessary but impossible. His movement was fluid like water, his voice was soft like wind through leaves, and his presence suggested someone who had found genuine peace in a world filled with unnecessary aggression and violence. The journey that had led David to become one of California's most respected teachers of peaceful martial arts had been one of gradual spiritual awakening. Beginning his training in traditional Chinese martial arts at age 15, he had initially been attracted by the physical techniques and the promise of becoming a formidable fighter. But as his practice deepened, he had discovered that the true value of martial arts lay not in their capacity for destruction, but in their potential for personal transformation. Martial arts are not about fighting, David would tell newcomers to the retreat, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades exploring the deepest philosophical dimensions of Eastern combat traditions. They are about learning to flow with the universe, to move in harmony with natural forces, to develop such complete inner peace that conflict becomes impossible. This philosophy had shaped every aspect of David's approach to martial arts instruction. His classes focused on slow, meditative movements that resembled dancing more than fighting, breathing exercises designed to cultivate inner stillness, and philosophical discussions about how martial artists could contribute to world peace through personal transformation. Students who came to the retreat seeking to learn fighting techniques were gently guided toward understanding that true strength came from nonviolence, true power from compassion, and true victory from refusing to engage in conflict. The Zen Mountain Retreat where David taught had become a pilgrimage destination for martial artists who had grown disillusioned with the competitive, aggressive approach that characterized most contemporary training. The facility attracted spiritual seekers, philosophical students, and practitioners who understood that the highest levels of martial arts development required transcending the need to prove oneself through combat. Elena Rodriguez, the retreat's spiritual director and a former student of several renowned meditation masters, had created Zen Mountain specifically to provide a sanctuary where martial arts could be studied as a form of spiritual practice rather than combat preparation. "We offer something different here," Elena would explain to visitors who seemed confused by the retreat's emphasis on peace over power. "Most martial arts schools teach students how to fight. We teach them how to never need to fight because they've developed such complete inner harmony that conflict simply doesn't arise around them." This perspective had created in David a deep concern about the direction that martial arts had taken in popular culture, particularly in America where fighting systems had become entertainment, competition, and expressions of individual ego, rather than paths to spiritual development. He genuinely believed that the popularization of martial arts through movies, television, and competitive sports had corrupted their essential nature, and led countless students away from their true purpose. David's approach to martial arts was fundamentally different from mainstream training methodology. Where typical schools emphasize techniques, sparring, and competitive preparation, the retreat focused on meditation, philosophical study, and movements designed to cultivate inner peace rather than external effectiveness. Students spent more time sitting in contemplation than practicing physical techniques, more time discussing compassion than learning combat applications. The moment you use martial arts for violence, you have failed to understand their true nature, David would explain during the philosophical sessions that were central to the retreat's curriculum. A true martial artist radiates such peace that others cannot feel aggressive around them. This is the highest level of martial arts, preventing conflict through the power of inner harmony. That Saturday afternoon, the retreat was hosting a special symposium about martial arts as spiritual practice, featuring speakers who would explore how traditional fighting systems could be adapted for contemporary spiritual development. The event had drawn participants from throughout California's alternative spirituality community, all seeking to deepen their understanding of how martial arts could contribute to personal enlightenment and world peace. Among the invited speakers was Chuck Norris, who had been asked to discuss how his decades of martial arts practice had influenced his understanding of personal responsibility and ethical behavior. Chuck's invitation had come through entertainment industry connections who appreciated his reputation for both martial arts excellence and personal integrity, though David had questioned whether someone associated with action movies could truly understand the peaceful nature of authentic martial arts. Chuck arrived at the Zen Mountain Retreat dressed in simple khaki pants and a white button-down shirt, his presence immediately recognizable but characteristically respectful of the environment's spiritual focus. At 73 years old, he moved through the peaceful setting with obvious appreciation for its beauty and tranquility, while maintaining the alert awareness that characterized his approach to any new environment. Accompanying Chuck were Dr. Patricia Williams, a philosopher who specialized in the intersection of Eastern spiritual practices and Western psychological development, and Robert Chen, no relation to David, a former martial arts competitor who now worked as a counselor helping athletes transition from competitive careers to more spiritually focused practices. They had come to the retreat as part of a broader research project about how martial arts could be integrated into contemporary approaches to mental health and spiritual development. Mr. Norris, Dr. Williams explained as they toured the facility, "We're particularly interested in your perspective on how martial arts training can develop not just physical capabilities, but also ethical awareness and spiritual insight." Chuck nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in the retreat's carefully designed environment with obvious appreciation for the thoughtfulness that had gone into creating such a peaceful setting. Martial arts definitely teach you things that go beyond fighting techniques. The discipline, the respect, the understanding of your own capabilities and limitations, those lessons probably matter more than any specific physical skills. David had been observing Chuck's arrival from across the retreat grounds, his assessment colored by assumptions that reflected his fundamental belief that authentic martial arts were incompatible with the aggressive energy he associated with competitive fighting and action entertainment. Here was someone whose primary public identity was built on images of violence and conflict, someone who, in David's worldview, represented exactly the kind of misunderstanding that had corrupted martial arts in popular culture. "This is exactly what I mean about the commercialization of martial arts," David said quietly to his assistant instructor, Sarah, while observing Chuck's interaction with other retreat participants. "Hollywood has taken sacred practices and turned them into entertainment violence. How can someone who built a career on fighting movies understand the true peaceful nature of martial arts?" Sarah, who had been studying at the retreat for 2 years, and had developed tremendous respect for David's philosophical insights, glanced at Chuck with the careful attention of someone trained to see beyond surface appearances to underlying spiritual energy. "Master David, he seems very calm and respectful. Maybe his public image doesn't reflect his actual approach to martial arts." David's response reflected his genuine belief that authentic spiritual development was incompatible with any form of aggressive expression, even fictional violence created for entertainment purposes. "Sarah, you cannot separate the energy you put into the world from who you are as a person. Someone who spends decades portraying violence, even pretend violence, cannot have developed true inner peace. The universe responds to the energy we cultivate, and violent energy, even in movies, creates violent karma." As the afternoon's formal presentations began, David listened with careful attention to discussions about spiritual development, ethical behavior, and the role that physical practice could play in cultivating wisdom and compassion. His own contribution to the group discussion was characteristically gentle but firm, emphasizing the importance of approaching martial arts as meditation in motion, the necessity of abandoning all aggressive intentions, and the possibility of developing such complete inner harmony that external conflict became impossible. Chuck had been observing David throughout the afternoon with growing interest in his obvious sincerity and deep commitment to using martial arts as a vehicle for spiritual development. The retreat master's insights about peace and harmony were genuinely thoughtful, his dedication to helping students develop inner tranquility was evident, and his philosophical approach to martial arts training was both sophisticated and internally consistent. During the question and answer period that followed Chuck's presentation about personal responsibility in martial arts, David raised his hand with the kind of gentle formality that characterized all his interactions but concealed fundamental concern about the spiritual implications of Chuck's public career. "Mr. Norris," David said, his voice carrying the soft authority of someone who spoke from deep contemplative practice, "I deeply appreciate your emphasis on personal responsibility and ethical behavior. However, I find myself troubled by what seems to be a fundamental contradiction between promoting peace and spending decades portraying violence in entertainment." Chuck nodded encouragingly, recognizing the sincerity behind the question even though he could sense its underlying challenge. "That's a fair question, Master Chen. I understand how the entertainment industry can create impressions that don't necessarily reflect someone's actual beliefs or approach to martial arts. The concern goes deeper than impressions," David continued, his tone maintaining perfect courtesy while making his philosophical position clear. "From a spiritual perspective, we become what we repeatedly practice. How do you reconcile decades of portraying aggressive energy with the cultivation of inner peace that represents authentic martial arts development?" The question hung in the air with obvious philosophical weight, though David's tone remained gentle and respectful. Dr. Williams leaned forward with interest, recognizing that this exchange touched on fundamental questions about the relationship between spiritual practice and public expression. Chuck considered the question carefully before responding. "I think you raise important points about the energy we put into the world. In my experience, though, there can be a difference between portraying conflict in fictional contexts and how someone actually approaches real-life situations." David's expression remained peacefully attentive, but his eyes showed that Chuck's answer hadn't addressed his deeper concerns about the spiritual implications of cultivating aggressive energy in any context. "But doesn't this miss the essential point about martial arts as spiritual practice? True martial arts development requires abandoning all aggressive tendencies, even fictional ones. How can authentic inner peace coexist with any form of violence, even pretend violence?" "I respect that perspective," Chuck replied with genuine appreciation for David's spiritual commitment. "I think different people might find different ways to integrate martial arts principles with other aspects of their lives. Maybe the goal is developing enough inner strength that you can handle whatever situations arise without losing your center." David nodded politely, but his body language suggested that he remained concerned about what he viewed as a fundamental misunderstanding of martial arts' true spiritual purpose. As the formal presentations concluded and the event moved into informal discussion and demonstration periods, he found himself increasingly bothered by what he saw as a missed opportunity to discuss the purely peaceful applications of martial arts practice. During a break in the proceedings, David approached Chuck with the kind of gentle respect that characterized the retreat's culture, but with an underlying agenda focused on demonstrating the superiority of purely peaceful martial arts over approaches that maintained any connection to aggressive energy. "Mr. Norris," he said, maintaining the soft formality that characterized all his interactions, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I would be very interested in exploring how purely peaceful martial arts practice differs from approaches that maintain connections to aggressive applications. Perhaps you would be willing to participate in a demonstration." Chuck's expression showed neither defensiveness nor surprise at what was clearly intended as a gentle but fundamental challenge to his approach. "I'd be happy to participate in any demonstration that would help explore these questions." "Wonderful," David said, his tone maintaining perfect peaceful courtesy, while his eyes reflected satisfaction at having created an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of purely spiritual martial arts over approaches that retained aggressive elements. "Perhaps we could explore how completely peaceful movement differs from techniques that maintain any potential for harmful application." Dr. Williams immediately recognized the significance of what was developing and discreetly signaled Robert to begin documenting the interaction. This kind of exchange between different philosophical approaches to martial arts was exactly the type of encounter their research was designed to analyze. Within minutes, a section of the retreat's main hall had been cleared and the symposium participants had gathered to observe what promised to be an illuminating demonstration of how different philosophical approaches to martial arts might manifest in practical application. David prepared for the demonstration with characteristic mindfulness, changing into flowing white clothing that emphasized the peaceful nature of his practice. His movements were graceful and centered, each gesture reflecting the kind of spiritual awareness that came from years of treating every physical action as a form of moving meditation. Chuck's preparation was notably different. He simply stood quietly in the designated area, doing gentle stretching movements that suggested respect for the demonstration's purpose rather than preparation for any kind of competitive encounter. At 73, his presence conveyed not the aggressive energy that David had expected, but a settled calm that seemed to arise from deep personal security rather than philosophical positioning. "What principles would you like to explore?" Chuck asked, his tone indicating genuine interest in understanding David's approach rather than challenging it. David's response revealed both his spiritual sophistication and his fundamental assumptions about the incompatibility of peace and power. "I'd like to demonstrate how purely peaceful martial arts movement differs from techniques that retain aggressive potential. True spiritual martial arts create only harmony, never conflict." "That sounds very interesting," Chuck agreed. "I'd like to understand better how that works in practice." David began moving in the flowing, meditative style that characterized his spiritual approach to martial arts, movements that resembled Tai Chi or ceremonial dance, more than combat techniques. His actions were beautiful, graceful, and clearly designed to cultivate inner peace rather than external effectiveness. Chuck observed with respectful attention, occasionally asking gentle questions about the philosophy behind specific movements or the spiritual significance of particular sequences. His interest seemed genuine, his questions thoughtful, and his energy completely non-threatening. But as the demonstration continued, something unexpected began to emerge. David's movements, beautiful though they were, seemed somehow incomplete when viewed alongside Chuck's simple but grounded presence. The retreat master's flowing techniques appeared graceful but insubstantial when contrasted with the quiet strength that Chuck radiated without any apparent effort. "Your movements are very beautiful," Chuck observed after several minutes of watching David's demonstration. "There's obviously tremendous spiritual development behind this practice." David nodded with satisfaction, feeling that his point about peaceful martial arts was being well received. "This is authentic martial arts, pure harmony without any aggressive energy. This is how these practices were meant to be used." Chuck nodded thoughtfully, then asked a question that would fundamentally shift the demonstration's direction. "Master Chen, what happens when someone encounters a situation where purely peaceful response isn't enough to protect others who can't protect themselves?" The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. David's immediate response reflected his philosophical certainty about the power of nonviolence. "True peace is so powerful that it transforms aggressive energy. Someone with authentic inner harmony never encounters situations requiring protective force because their peaceful energy prevents conflict from arising." "That's a beautiful ideal," Chuck replied gently. "But what about protecting someone who's already in danger? What about situations where peace hasn't been able to prevent harm from beginning?" David's confident answer revealed the logical conclusion of his purely peaceful philosophy. "Spiritual martial arts teach us that true protection comes from radiating such powerful peaceful energy that aggressors cannot maintain their aggressive intentions. Violence, even protective violence, creates more violence." Chuck's response was delivered with characteristic gentleness, but its implications were profound. "Master Chen, what if someone you cared about was in immediate physical danger? What if peaceful energy wasn't enough to stop someone who was determined to cause harm?" For the first time in the demonstration, David seemed uncertain. His philosophical framework provided clear answers about the power of peaceful energy, but Chuck's questions were pointing toward practical situations where purely theoretical approaches might prove inadequate. David began, then paused. "True martial arts masters never encounter such situations because their spiritual development prevents them from arising." Chuck's gentle persistence revealed the gap between philosophical idealism and practical responsibility. "But Master Chen, most of us aren't true masters yet. Most of us are still learning. What about people who need protection while they're developing that level of spiritual mastery? The question exposed something that David had never fully considered, the possibility that purely peaceful approaches, however spiritually sophisticated, might be insufficient for protecting others who hadn't yet developed advanced spiritual capabilities themselves. Chuck continued with careful respect for David's spiritual commitment. I think your approach to cultivating inner peace is genuinely valuable. But maybe true balance includes being prepared to protect others when peaceful methods aren't sufficient. David found himself facing a philosophical challenge that his retreat training hadn't prepared him for, the recognition that pure pacifism, however spiritually attractive, might represent an incomplete response to the complex moral demands of protecting innocent people from harm. But doesn't any preparation for protective force contaminate the peaceful energy we're trying to cultivate? David asked, his certainty beginning to waver. Chuck's response revealed wisdom that transcended the simple opposition between peace and power. Maybe true spiritual development includes being strong enough to protect others while still preferring peace? Maybe the highest level isn't avoiding all potential for protective action, but having that capability while hoping never to need it. The insight hit David with unexpected force. For years, he had believed that authentic martial arts required the complete abandonment of all aggressive capabilities. But Chuck was suggesting something more nuanced, that true spiritual strength might include the capacity for protective action combined with the wisdom to use it only when peaceful alternatives had been exhausted. You're saying that true balance includes both sides? David asked slowly, his worldview beginning to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. I think balance might mean being completely committed to peace while being prepared to protect others when peace isn't enough, Chuck replied gently. Not because we want conflict, but because we care enough about innocent people to be ready when they need protection. Dr. Williams stepped forward, recognizing that the demonstration had evolved into something more profound than either participant had initially intended. What we're witnessing explores one of the deepest questions in spiritual practice, whether true compassion sometimes requires the willingness to use protective force on behalf of those who cannot protect themselves. David stood in the peaceful hall, his spiritual certainties undergoing the kind of fundamental reassessment that only comes from encountering wisdom that transcends simple categories. For years, he had believed that authentic martial arts development required complete pacifism. But Chuck was revealing a more complex understanding, one that honored peace while acknowledging the moral responsibility to protect the innocent. I think, David said slowly, I may have been pursuing spiritual purity at the expense of practical compassion. Chuck's response embodied the humility that had characterized his entire approach to the interaction. I think your commitment to peace is genuinely valuable. Maybe the goal isn't choosing between peace and protection, but developing enough wisdom to know when each is most appropriate. As the demonstration concluded and the retreat began to return to its normal rhythm, David approached Chuck with a request that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the afternoon. Chuck, he said, using the informal address for the first time, would you be willing to help our students understand how to maintain spiritual commitment to peace while developing the capability to protect others when necessary? Chuck's response exemplified the integration of spiritual wisdom and practical responsibility that had defined his entire approach to martial arts. I think we could learn from each other. Your spiritual insights are genuinely valuable, probably deeper than anything I've developed through my more practical training. But maybe together we can explore how peace and protection can strengthen each other rather than competing. In the months that followed, the Zen Mountain Retreat quietly incorporated elements of protective training into its spiritual curriculum. David maintained his deep commitment to peace and spiritual development, but he began teaching students that true compassion sometimes required the strength to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. The video documentation from that afternoon's demonstration became a case study in applied philosophy programs throughout the academic community, not because it showed one approach defeating another, but because it demonstrated how apparent opposites could be integrated into more complete understanding. A year later, when David published his book, The Warrior's Peace, Integrating Spiritual Development with Protective Responsibility, he dedicated it to what he called, "The afternoon I learned that true balance includes both sides of the spiritual equation." Chuck, characteristically, deflected credit for David's expanded understanding. He already had the spiritual foundation, Chuck told Dr. Williams when she asked about the transformation she had witnessed. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see that true peace isn't the absence of strength, it's having strength and choosing to use it wisely. And sometimes, the most profound spiritual lessons come not from pursuing perfect peace, but from discovering that true compassion requires the courage to protect others, understanding that the highest spiritual development includes both the commitment to harmony and the strength to defend it when necessary.